Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. 6 months ago, I thought I understood the rules of modern dating. I thought I knew what it meant when someone said they wanted to take things slow, when they talked about not being ready for something serious, when they insisted they valued our friendship above all else. I thought I was playing the same game as everyone else, following the same unspoken guidelines that governed how two people navigate the murky waters between friendship and something more. I was wrong about everything. My name is Felix, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend most of my days alone in my home office, creating logos and marketing materials for small businesses. It's solitary work, but I prefer it that way. I've never been particularly good at office politics or small talk, and working for myself allows me to focus on what I do best without having to pretend to be someone I'm not. The isolation of my job means that my social circle is relatively small. I have a handful of close friends from college, a few neighbors I'm friendly with, and the usual collection of acquaintances you accumulate over the years. But 6 months ago, that circle expanded by one person who would change everything I thought I knew about relationships, manipulation, and my own capacity for decisive action. Her name is Celeste, and I met her at a coffee shop downtown on a rainy Tuesday morning in October. I was there working on a project, taking advantage of the ambient noise and caffeine to push through a particularly challenging design problem. She was at the table next to mine, laptop open, papers scattered around her workspace, muttering under her breath at whatever was on her screen. When her phone rang and she answered with a frustrated explanation about late client payments and overdue invoices, I realized she was probably a fellow freelancer. When she hung up and let out an exasperated sigh, I made an impulsive decision that would define the next 6 months of my life. I offered to buy her a coffee and commiserate about the challenges of self-employment. She looked up at me with these striking green eyes, smiled, and accepted. That simple exchange led to a 3-hour conversation that covered everything from our respective careers to our shared love of obscure documentaries to our mutual frustration with dating apps. Celeste was 26, a freelance writer who specialized in marketing copy and blog content. She was smart, funny, and had this way of making even mundane topics feel engaging and important. She was also beautiful in an understated way that caught you off guard. Shoulder-length auburn hair, freckles across her nose, and an expressive face that revealed exactly what she was thinking at any given moment. By the time we parted ways that afternoon, we'd exchanged numbers and made plans to meet for dinner later that week. I walked home feeling more optimistic about my romantic prospects than I had in months. There had been an easy chemistry between us, a natural flow to our conversation that suggested we might actually be compatible in ways that mattered. Our first official date exceeded my expectations. We went to a small Italian restaurant in my neighborhood, one of those family-owned places with mismatched furniture and incredible homemade pasta. The conversation picked up exactly where it had left off at the coffee shop, and I found myself opening up to her in ways I rarely did with new people. Celeste had this gift for asking the right questions, for showing genuine interest in my answers, for making me feel like my thoughts and experiences were worth sharing. She told me about her childhood in a small town upstate, her decision to move to the city after college, her dreams of eventually writing a novel. I told her about my own creative aspirations, my plans to eventually transition from commercial design work to more artistic projects. The evening ended with a kiss on her doorstep that left me floating for days afterward. It wasn't passionate or dramatic, just soft and sweet and full of promise. As I walked home, I felt like I was at the beginning of something significant, something that might actually develop into the kind of relationship I'd been hoping to find. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a comfortable pattern. We'd meet for coffee during the day, sometimes working together in companionable silence, sometimes taking breaks to explore the city or visit museums. We had dinner together twice a week, alternating between trying new restaurants and cooking at each other's apartments. We texted throughout the day, sharing funny observations or interesting articles or just checking in with each other. It felt like the early stages of a real relationship, the kind where two people gradually integrate their lives and start building something together. Celeste introduced me to her favorite bookstore, her preferred hiking trail, her go-to brunch spot. I showed her the best places to find vintage furniture, the gallery district she'd never explored, the jazz club where I'd been going to hear live music for years. But there were also signs that I chose to ignore, red flags that I rationalized away because I wanted so badly for things to work between us. Celeste was inconsistent with communication, sometimes responding to texts immediately, sometimes disappearing for hours or even days without explanation. She was vague about her schedule, often canceling plans at the last minute due to work obligations or family commitments that seemed to arrive without warning. Most significantly, she was adamant about taking things slowly physically. We kissed goodnight after every date, but she always pulled back when things started to get more intense. When I suggested spending the night at her place after we'd been seeing each other for a month, she said she wasn't ready for that level of intimacy yet. She wanted to build a strong emotional foundation before we moved forward physically. I respected her boundaries completely, but I also found her reasoning confusing. We were spending significant time together, having deep conversations, clearly enjoying each other's company. What more did she need to feel emotionally connected? But I pushed those doubts aside, telling myself that everyone moves at their own pace, that her caution probably meant she was taking our potential relationship seriously. After 6 weeks of dating, Celeste suggested we have a conversation about what we were to each other. She said she cared about me deeply, but wasn't ready to be in an exclusive relationship yet. She valued our connection, but needed more time to figure out what she wanted long term. She hoped we could continue seeing each other while keeping things casual and open. The conversation took place at her apartment on a Sunday evening in late November. We were sitting on her couch after sharing a bottle of wine and a homemade dinner that had taken us most of the afternoon to prepare together. The domestic intimacy of the entire day had made me hopeful that she was ready to take things to the next level, which made her words even more jarring. I asked what she meant by keeping things open, whether she was planning to date other people. She said she wasn't actively looking for anyone else, but she didn't want to close off possibilities either. She was still figuring out what she wanted in life, still exploring who she was as a person, still not ready to make the kind of commitment that exclusivity would require. I told her I understood, that I was willing to give her the space and time she needed. I said I'd rather have her in my life on her terms than not at all, which was true but probably not the smartest negotiating position I could have taken. She seemed relieved by my acceptance of her conditions, and we spent the rest of the evening talking about our favorite books and planning a weekend trip to visit some art galleries in a neighboring city. Looking back, I can see that this conversation established a dynamic that would define our relationship for the next 4 months. Celeste got to enjoy all the benefits of having me in her life: companionship, emotional support, someone to share experiences with, without having to reciprocate with the same level of commitment or investment. I got the illusion of a relationship while actually serving as a placeholder for whatever she was really looking for. But at the time, I convinced myself that I was being mature and understanding, that good relationships required patience and compromise, that she would eventually recognize how compatible we were and want to make things official between us. I thought I was playing the long game, building trust and demonstrating my reliability so that when she was ready for something serious, I'd be the obvious choice. The holidays came and went with a series of mixed signals that should have clarified the situation, but somehow made it more confusing instead. Celeste invited me to her company's Christmas party as her date, introducing me to her colleagues as someone special in her life. We exchanged thoughtful gifts. I gave her a first edition of her favorite novel that I'd tracked down through a rare book dealer, and she gave me a vintage camera she'd found at an estate sale. We spent New Year's Eve together at a house party thrown by one of her friends, kissing at midnight like any other couple celebrating the start of a new year together. To outside observers, we probably looked like two people in a committed relationship, and part of me started to believe that's what we actually were, regardless of what labels we used to describe it. But January brought a shift in her behavior that forced me to confront the reality of our situation. Celeste became less available, more distracted during our time together, more likely to cut our dates short due to other obligations. She was still affectionate and engaged when we were together, but those times became increasingly rare and felt more precious because of their scarcity. When I asked if everything was okay, she assured me that nothing had changed between us, that she was just going through a busy period at work and dealing with some family stress. She said she valued our relationship and didn't want me to worry about her temporary unavailability. She promised things would get back to normal soon. I wanted to believe her, and mostly I did. But there was a nagging voice in the back of my mind that suggested something fundamental had shifted in her priorities, that I was no longer as important to her as I had been during those first few months. I told myself I was being paranoid, that everyone goes through busy periods, that relationships naturally have ebbs and flows. I had no idea that she had already met someone else, someone who would eventually force both of us to confront what we actually meant to each other. I had no idea that my patience and understanding and willingness to accept her terms were about to be tested in ways I never could have anticipated. All I knew was that I was falling in love with a woman who seemed to be slowly pulling away from me, and I had no idea how to bridge the growing distance between us without pushing her away entirely. I thought the solution was to be even more patient, even more understanding, even more willing to accept whatever level of involvement she was comfortable with. I was about to learn how wrong I could be. February arrived with an unexpected thaw that made the whole city feel optimistic, but my relationship with Celeste continued its slow descent into uncertainty. Our weekly dinners became bi-weekly, then sporadic. Our daily text exchanges dwindled to occasional check-ins that felt more obligatory than organic. When we did spend time together, she seemed distracted, like part of her attention was always somewhere else. I started analyzing every interaction, looking for clues about what had changed. Was she losing interest in me personally, or was she genuinely just overwhelmed with work and family obligations as she claimed? Had I done something wrong, or was this natural evolution in a relationship that had never been clearly defined? The uncertainty was eating away at my confidence and making me second-guess every decision I made regarding how to handle the situation. My friends offered varying advice that ranged from unhelpful to counterproductive. Marcus told me I should give her an ultimatum, commit to being exclusive or end things entirely. Sarah suggested I should start dating other people to show Celeste what she was missing. My neighbor David, who'd been married for 15 years, advised me to just be patient and let her work through whatever she was dealing with. But I couldn't bring myself to follow any of their suggestions. An ultimatum felt manipulative and likely to backfire. Dating other people seemed dishonest when I only wanted to be with Celeste. And patience, while admirable in theory, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain when I felt like I was losing her a little more each day. In mid-February, Celeste suggested we meet for coffee on a Tuesday afternoon, our first planned interaction in over a week. I arrived at our usual spot 10 minutes early, nervous and hopeful that this meeting might provide some clarity about where we stood. When she walked in 15 minutes late, apologizing breathlessly about getting caught up in a phone call with a client, I felt a familiar mixture of relief at seeing her and frustration at her continued inability to prioritize our time together. She looked beautiful but tired, with shadows under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. She'd lost some weight, which made her already delicate features appear even more fragile. When she sat down across from me with her usual caramel latte, I noticed her hands were shaking slightly, either from caffeine or nerves or something else entirely. We made small talk for the first few minutes, updates on our respective work projects, complaints about the unpredictable weather, observations about the new art installation that had appeared in the coffee shop since our last visit. But I could tell she had something specific she wanted to discuss, some reason she'd suggested this meeting beyond just catching up. Finally, after we'd exhausted the safe topics of conversation, Celeste took a deep breath and told me she had something she needed to share with me. She said she valued our friendship too much to keep secrets from me, that honesty was the foundation of any meaningful relationship, that she hoped I would understand and support her regardless of how she felt about what she was about to tell me. The preamble made my stomach clench with anticipation. In my experience, conversations that began with disclaimers about honesty and friendship rarely ended well for the person listening. I braced myself for news that she wanted to end our relationship entirely, that she'd decided she needed space to focus on other priorities, that she'd realized we weren't as compatible as she'd initially thought. Instead, she told me about Marcus. Not my friend Marcus, but a different Marcus, a lawyer she'd met at a networking event 3 weeks earlier. She described him as intelligent, successful, charming, and everything she'd been looking for in a potential partner. They'd been on 2 dates, and she was excited about the possibility of something serious developing between them. As she spoke, I felt like I was watching the conversation from outside my own body. She was telling me about another man with the same casual tone she might use to describe a new restaurant she'd discovered or a book she'd recently read. There was no acknowledgement of how this information might affect me, no recognition that her excitement about dating someone else might be painful for me to hear. She talked about their first date, dinner at an upscale steakhouse followed by drinks at a rooftop bar with a view of the city skyline. She described how easy the conversation had been, how much they had in common professionally, how impressed she'd been by his knowledge of wine and his ability to make her laugh. She mentioned that he'd texted her the next morning to say he'd had a wonderful time and wanted to see her again as soon as possible. Their second date had been even better, she continued. He'd taken her to a private art gallery opening that he'd gotten invited to through his law firm's connections. She'd worn her favorite black dress, the one I'd complimented her on during one of our early dates, and felt sophisticated and beautiful on his arm as they mingled with the city's cultural elite. She told me about the kiss they'd shared at the end of that second date, how different it felt from the casual goodnight kisses she'd been accustomed to with other people she'd dated recently. She said there was something electric about their connection, something that made her feel like she was finally meeting someone who could match her intellectually and emotionally. Throughout this entire monologue, I sat frozen in my chair, coffee growing cold in front of me, trying to process what she was telling me and why she thought I needed to hear it. She was describing the beginning of a romance with someone else while sitting across from me, someone she'd been seeing regularly for 5 months, someone who'd been patient with her boundaries and supportive of her need to take things slow. The most painful part wasn't just that she was interested in someone else, it was the way she described her feelings about him. The excitement in her voice when she talked about Marcus was something I'd never heard when she talked about our relationship. The anticipation she felt about seeing him again was something she'd never expressed about spending time with me. The electric connection she mentioned was apparently something we'd never shared, despite all our deep conversations and moments of intimacy. When she finished describing her budding romance, she looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for my reaction or blessing. She said she hoped she was happy for her, that she knew she wanted her to find someone who could give her what she was looking for in a relationship. She said our friendship was too important to her to let anything interfere with it, including her dating other people. I realized she was waiting for me to respond, to say something that would indicate how I was processing this information. The silence stretched between us while I tried to formulate words that would adequately express what I was feeling without making her feel guilty or uncomfortable. Finally, I managed to tell her that I was glad she'd found someone she was excited about, that she deserved to be happy, that I appreciated her being honest with me about the situation. The words felt hollow and false as I spoke them, but they seemed to be what she wanted to hear. She smiled with relief and reached across the table to squeeze my hand briefly, a gesture that would have meant everything to me a few months earlier, but now felt patronizing and dismissive. She said she'd been worried about how to tell me, that she'd been afraid I might not understand or might try to talk her out of pursuing things with Marcus. As if I had any right or ability to talk her out of anything. As if my opinion mattered in her decision-making process about who she wanted to date or sleep with or potentially build a future with. As if the 5 months we'd spent together had given me any claim on her emotions or choices or time. She stayed for another 20 minutes, chatting cheerfully about her work projects and asking about mine, apparently satisfied that she'd handled a potentially difficult conversation with grace and maturity. She seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing her secret had lifted a weight from her shoulders. She was practically glowing with the happiness of new romance, and I found myself studying her face, trying to memorize what she looked like when she was genuinely excited about someone. When she finally left, giving me a friendly hug and promising we'd talk soon, I remained sitting at our table for another hour, staring at the spot where she'd been sitting and trying to understand what had just happened to my life. The woman I'd been falling in love with for 5 months had just told me about falling in love with someone else. She'd done it with enthusiasm and joy, expecting me to share in her happiness like a good friend should. She'd made it clear that while she valued our relationship, it was nothing compared to what she felt for Marcus after just 2 dates. I walked home in a daze, replaying the conversation and trying to identify where I'd gone wrong. Had I been too available, too accommodating, too willing to accept her terms without advocating for my own needs? Had I misread the signals between us so completely that I'd convinced myself we had something special when she'd never felt anything beyond casual affection? That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling and facing some uncomfortable truths about my situation. Celeste had never promised me exclusivity. She'd been upfront from the beginning about not being ready for a serious relationship. She told me she wanted to keep things open, and I'd agreed to her terms without really considering what that meant in practice. But knowledge and emotion are two different things, and knowing that she had the right to date other people didn't make hearing about Marcus any less devastating. I'd spent 5 months building something I thought was meaningful, while she'd apparently been keeping her options open and waiting for someone better to come along. The most humiliating realization was that she genuinely seemed to think I'd be happy for her, that I'd want to hear about her romantic success with someone else, that I'd continue to be available as her friend while she pursued a real relationship with Marcus. She'd managed our entire interaction with such casual confidence that I wondered if she'd ever considered how her news might affect me. I spent the next few days in a fog of hurt and confusion, going through the motions of work and daily life while trying to figure out how to move forward. Part of me wanted to cut off contact with Celeste entirely, to spare myself the pain of watching her fall in love with someone else. But another part of me still hoped that things with Marcus might not work out, that she might realize what she was giving up by choosing him over me. A week after our coffee shop conversation, Celeste texted me asking if I wanted to grab dinner and catch up. She suggested our usual Italian place, apparently unaware that the location held any special significance for me or that I might not want to sit across from her and pretend everything was normal between us. I stared at her text for hours before responding, trying to decide whether maintaining our friendship was worth the emotional cost it would require. I knew that seeing her regularly while she developed feelings for Marcus would be torture, but I also couldn't bring myself to end our connection completely. Finally, I texted back agreeing to dinner, telling myself that maybe I could handle being just friends with her, that maybe I could find a way to be genuinely happy about her new relationship. I was about to discover just how wrong I could be about my own emotional resilience and just how much more complicated the situation was about to become. The dinner at our usual Italian restaurant was even worse than I'd anticipated. Celeste arrived 20 minutes late, apologizing with a radiant smile and explaining that she'd been on the phone with Marcus, who had called to tell her about his day in court. She was practically vibrating with excitement as she described how passionate he'd sounded talking about a case he was working on, how impressed she was by his dedication to his clients, how sexy she found his professional intensity. I sat across from her, mechanically eating pasta that tasted like cardboard, listening to her gush about a man she'd known for less than a month, while I'd been relegated to the role of supportive friend. She talked about their third date, a weekend brunch, followed by a walk through the botanical gardens, with the kind of detail that suggested she'd been replaying every moment in her mind since it happened. She told me about how he'd held her hand while they walked, how natural it felt to be physically close to him, how different their chemistry was from anything she'd experienced before. She mentioned that they talked about taking a weekend trip together, maybe to the mountains or the coast, somewhere they could spend uninterrupted time getting to know each other better. The casual mention of a romantic getaway was like a knife twist. In 5 months of seeing each other, Celeste had never suggested we take a trip together. She never wanted to spend a full weekend with me, claiming she needed space to maintain her independence. But after 3 dates with Marcus, she was already planning overnight adventures with him. When she asked how I was doing, what was new in my life, whether I'd been dating anyone recently, I gave vague responses that satisfied her surface-level curiosity without revealing the depth of my emotional turmoil. She nodded along with my updates about work projects and weekend plans, but I could tell her attention was elsewhere. She kept checking her phone, presumably hoping for texts from Marcus, and her smile would brighten whenever the screen lit up. That night, after walking her to her apartment building and receiving another one of those friendly, dismissive hugs, I made a decision that would change everything between us. I wasn't going to continue playing the role of the patient, understanding friend who celebrated her romantic successes with other men. I wasn't going to keep accepting crumbs of her attention while she gave her real energy and excitement to someone else. But I also wasn't going to confront her directly or try to convince her to choose me over Marcus. That approach would only make me look desperate and probably drive her further away. Instead, I was going to take control of my own narrative and show her what she'd been taking for granted all these months. I started by going completely silent. No more daily texts checking in on her day, no more responses to her casual messages about work stress or funny things she'd seen online. When she texted me 3 days after our dinner asking if everything was okay, I waited 12 hours before responding with a brief message saying I'd been busy with a demanding project and would catch up with her soon. The silence wasn't just about making her miss my attention. It was about creating space for me to figure out who I wanted to be in this situation. For months, I'd been reactive, responding to her moods and availability, adjusting my expectations based on her signals. Now, I was going to be proactive, making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what I thought she needed from me. During that first week of minimal contact, I threw myself into work with renewed focus and started making changes to other areas of my life that I'd been neglecting. I signed up for a photography class I'd been considering for months, something that would give me an outlet for creativity beyond my commercial design work. I started going to the gym regularly, not because I thought physical fitness would win Celeste back, but because I wanted to feel stronger and more confident in my own body. I also began dating other people, something I should have been doing all along if I truly accepted that our relationship was casual and non-exclusive. I updated my dating app profiles, started responding to matches I'd been ignoring, and scheduled coffee dates with women who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. The first woman I met was Rebecca, a marketing manager with a warm laugh and an impressive collection of vintage band t-shirts. She was straightforward about wanting to date seriously, looking for someone who could match her emotional investment, tired of games and mixed signals. Our first date lasted 4 hours as we talked about everything from our career ambitions to our favorite travel destinations to our experiences with modern dating culture. The second woman was Natasha, a yoga instructor who radiated the kind of calm confidence I found incredibly attractive. She was recently divorced, approaching dating with a mature perspective that came from having been in a long-term committed relationship. She knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to ask direct questions about my intentions and availability. Both women were interesting, attractive, and genuinely available in ways that Celeste had never been. They responded to texts promptly, made concrete plans, showed up on time, and seemed genuinely excited to spend time with me. The contrast with Celeste's behavior over the past few months was stark and illuminating. After 2 weeks of radio silence, Celeste called me on a Thursday evening. I was at home editing photos from my photography class when her name appeared on my phone screen. I let it go to voicemail, curious about what she'd say when forced to leave a message rather than engage in real-time conversation. Her voicemail was a rambling 3-minute monologue that revealed more about her state of mind than she probably intended. She said she'd been thinking about me, wondering how I was doing, hoping I wasn't avoiding her because of something she'd done wrong. She mentioned that she'd driven past the coffee shop where we used to meet and felt nostalgic about our early conversations. She asked me to call her back when I had a chance, saying she missed talking to me. The message was revealing because it was the first time she'd expressed any sense of loss about our decreased contact. For months, she'd taken my availability for granted, assuming I'd always be there whenever she needed companionship or emotional support. Now that I'd withdrawn that availability, she was finally noticing what had been missing from her life. I didn't call her back immediately. Instead, I waited another few days before sending a casual text suggesting we meet for coffee the following week. I chose a different location this time, a place we'd never been together, somewhere that didn't hold associations with our previous dynamic. When I arrived at the new coffee shop, I got there exactly on time rather than my usual 10 minutes early. Celeste was already there, which surprised me since punctuality had never been her strength. She looked anxious, fidgeting with her phone and glancing toward the door every few seconds until she spotted me. She stood up to hug me, and I noticed she held on a little longer than usual, as if testing whether our physical chemistry had survived my absence. I kept the embrace brief and friendly, maintaining the emotional distance I'd been cultivating for the past few weeks. As we settled into our seats with our drinks, she immediately launched into an explanation of why she'd been calling and texting. She said she'd been worried about me, concerned that something was wrong in my life that I wasn't sharing with her. She asked if I was upset about something she'd said or done, whether our last dinner conversation had made me uncomfortable in some way. I assured her that nothing was wrong, that I'd simply been busy with work and focusing on some personal projects. I mentioned the photography class casually, describing it as something I'd decided to pursue to expand my creative horizons. She seemed surprised that I'd made this decision without mentioning it to her, as if she expected to be consulted about my choices. Then she started talking about Marcus again, and I realized that part of her concern about my availability was related to her need for emotional support as her new relationship developed. She wanted to process her feelings about him with someone who knew her well, and my absence had deprived her of her usual sounding board. She told me about their fourth and fifth dates, about meeting some of his friends at a dinner party, about how well she'd fit into his social circle. She described his apartment, his impressive book collection, his sophisticated taste in everything from furniture to wine. She was building a picture of a life she wanted to be part of, and she seemed to need my validation that she was making good choices. But she also mentioned some concerns that suggested the relationship wasn't as perfect as she'd initially presented it. Marcus was incredibly busy with work, often canceling plans at the last minute when urgent legal matters arose. He was more reserved emotionally than she was used to, taking longer to open up about personal topics. She sometimes felt like she was competing with his career for his attention and investment. As she talked, I found myself analyzing her complaints about Marcus with detached interest rather than the hope I might have felt a few weeks earlier. She was discovering what I'd known all along, that exciting chemistry and sophisticated lifestyle don't necessarily translate into emotional availability or genuine compatibility. But instead of offering comfort or advice as I would have in the past, I simply listened and made neutral observations. When she asked what I thought about her concerns, I told her that every relationship has challenges and that she'd have to decide for herself whether Marcus's positive qualities outweighed his limitations. She seemed frustrated by my lack of engagement, as if she'd been expecting me to help her work through her doubts or reassure her that things with Marcus would improve over time. She was learning that emotional support wasn't something she could take for granted, that people's availability wasn't unlimited even when they cared about you. Before we parted ways, I mentioned that I'd been dating some new people, not with any intention of making her jealous, but simply as a matter of factual update. Her reaction was immediate and telling: surprise, curiosity, and something that looked distinctly like discomfort. She asked questions about who I was seeing, how I'd met them, whether anything serious was developing. I answered her questions with the same casual tone she'd used when telling me about Marcus, describing my recent dates as fun and promising without going into excessive detail. I could see her processing this information, perhaps for the first time, considering that my emotional energy and romantic attention weren't exclusively reserved for her. When I walked away from that coffee meeting, I felt a shift in the dynamic between us that was both subtle and significant. For the first time in our relationship, I was the one with secrets and exciting developments to share. I was the one moving forward with my life while she was dealing with uncertainty and doubt. I was the one with options and choices while she was trying to make something work with someone who couldn't match her investment. The most important realization was that I no longer needed her validation or approval to feel good about myself. The photography class, the gym routine, the new dating experiences, all of these changes were making me feel more confident and self-directed than I'd been in months. I was remembering who I'd been before I'd gotten caught up in trying to earn Celeste's love and commitment. What happened next would test whether I could maintain this new sense of independence, and whether Celeste would finally recognize what she'd been taking for granted all along. 3 weeks after our coffee shop meeting, the situation with Celeste reached a turning point that I never could have predicted. It started with a text message she sent at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night, a time when she'd usually be out with Marcus or at least texting him instead of me. The message was longer than her usual brief check-ins, and the tone suggested she was in some kind of emotional distress. She wrote that things with Marcus weren't going the way she'd hoped, that she was starting to realize he might not be the right person for her after all. She said she'd been thinking about our friendship a lot lately, about how much she valued my perspective and support, about how different I was from the other men she dated. She asked if we could meet soon, saying she really needed to see me. The old Felix would have dropped everything to comfort her, would have seen this message as an opportunity to finally show her how much better I could treat her than Marcus ever could. But the new Felix, the one who spent the past month rebuilding his confidence and exploring other options, read her message with a more analytical eye. This wasn't about her suddenly realizing she had feelings for me. This was about her needing emotional support during a difficult time and reaching out to the person who had always provided that support without asking for anything in return. She was treating me like an emergency contact for her romantic disappointments, someone she could turn to when her first-choice relationship hit obstacles. I waited until the next morning to respond, and when I did, I suggested we meet for dinner the following week. I chose a restaurant neither of us had been to before, an upscale place that required reservations and would create a different atmosphere than our usual casual meetups. If she wanted my time and attention, she was going to have to treat it as valuable rather than something she could access whenever convenient for her. The day of our dinner, I spent extra time getting ready. I wore my best suit, the charcoal gray one I'd bought for client presentations, along with a shirt and tie that made me feel confident and professional. I got a haircut that morning and made sure I looked like someone who had his life together, someone whose time was worth respecting. I arrived at the restaurant exactly on time and was shown to our table. When Celeste walked in 10 minutes later, I could see her scanning the dining room until she spotted me. Her expression when she saw me was one of surprise and something else I couldn't quite identify. Was it appreciation or perhaps recognition that something had changed about me? She was dressed more formally than usual too, in a black dress that I remembered from one of our early dates, and she'd clearly put effort into her hair and makeup. As she approached the table, I stood to greet her, but instead of the usual friendly hug, I simply pulled out her chair and waited for her to sit down before taking my own seat. The gesture was polite but distant, establishing a different tone for our interaction. She seemed to sense the shift immediately, commenting on how nice the restaurant was, how I chose well, how handsome I looked in my suit. The compliments felt like testing, as if she was trying to gauge whether I was still susceptible to her charm and attention. Once we'd ordered our meals, she launched into the story I'd been expecting to hear. Things with Marcus had become increasingly complicated over the past few weeks. His demanding work schedule meant he was constantly canceling or rescheduling their plans. When they did spend time together, he often seemed distracted, checking his phone for work emails or taking calls that couldn't wait until morning. She described a recent dinner date where he'd spent most of the evening discussing a complex case with a colleague who'd called him with questions. Another time, he'd left her apartment at 6 a.m. to deal with an emergency at his firm, promising to make it up to her later but never following through. She was starting to feel like an afterthought in his life, someone he squeezed in between more important priorities. But the real problem, she said, was that she was beginning to suspect Marcus saw her as more of a conquest than a potential partner. He was charming and attentive when he wanted something from her, but distant and unavailable when she needed emotional support or deeper conversation. She'd started to wonder if his interest in her was primarily physical, if he was just enjoying the excitement of a new relationship without considering anything long-term. As she talked, I found myself listening with the same detached interest I might have for a story about mutual acquaintances, rather than the intense emotional investment I would have had a few months earlier. She was describing exactly the kind of treatment she'd been giving me for months. Inconsistent attention, mixed signals, prioritizing other things over the relationship. But she seemed genuinely surprised and hurt to be on the receiving end of such behavior. When she paused in her narrative, clearly expecting some kind of response from me, I simply asked if she'd communicated her concerns to Marcus directly. Had she told him how his behavior was affecting her? Had she asked him what his intentions were for their relationship? Had she tried to establish boundaries around his work, interrupting their personal time? She seemed taken aback by my practical questions, as if she'd been expecting sympathy and validation rather than problem-solving suggestions. She said she didn't want to seem needy or demanding, that she was afraid of pushing him away by asking for too much too soon. She wanted him to recognize her needs without her having to explicitly state them. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. For months, I'd been hoping she would recognize my feelings and commitment without me having to demand exclusivity or push for more serious commitment. I'd been patient and understanding while she kept her options open. But now that she was experiencing similar uncertainty with someone else, she was struggling with the same fears and insecurities I'd been dealing with. Instead of pointing out this parallel, I suggested that perhaps Marcus's behavior was telling her everything she needed to know about his priorities and intentions. People make time for what's important to them, and if she wasn't important enough for him to be fully present during their limited time together, that was valuable information about their compatibility. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between surprise and admiration. She said I sounded different, more confident and direct than she was used to. She asked if something had changed in my life, if I was seeing someone who was influencing my perspective on relationships. I told her I'd been dating several people recently, exploring different types of connections and learning more about what I wanted in a relationship. I mentioned Rebecca and Natasha without going into excessive detail, but made it clear that I was actively pursuing romantic opportunities rather than waiting around for situations to develop naturally. The effect of this information on Celeste was immediate and dramatic. She became more animated, asking specific questions about the women I was seeing, how I'd met them, what I liked about them. She seemed particularly interested in knowing whether I was serious about any of these relationships, whether I was considering exclusivity with anyone. I answered her questions honestly but without the emotional intensity she seemed to be fishing for. I described my recent dates as enjoyable and promising, mentioned that I was planning a weekend trip with Rebecca to visit her friends in another city, and explained that Natasha and I had been talking about taking a cooking class together. As I talked about these other women, I watched Celeste's face cycle through a range of expressions. She seemed genuinely surprised that I'd moved on so completely from our previous dynamic, that I was building meaningful connections with people who were fully available and interested in me. For the first time since I'd known her, she was seeing me as someone with options and choices rather than someone who would always be waiting for her attention. The conversation took an unexpected turn when she asked directly whether I was still interested in her romantically. She said she'd always assumed I had feelings for her, but had respected my acceptance of her need to keep things casual. Now she was wondering if those feelings still existed or if my new dating experiences had changed how I felt about our connection. I paused for a long moment before answering, not because I was uncertain about my feelings, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. I told her that I had indeed had romantic feelings for her, that I'd hoped our relationship might develop into something more serious over time. But I also said that her choice to pursue Marcus while keeping me in a friendship role had clarified where I stood in her priorities. I explained that I'd realized I deserved to be someone's first choice rather than their backup option, that I wanted to be with someone who was excited about building a future together rather than someone who was still exploring other possibilities. I said I valued our friendship but was no longer interested in a romantic relationship with her. Her reaction was unlike anything I'd ever seen from her. She became visibly emotional, tears welling up in her eyes as she told me she'd made a mistake, that she'd been confused about what she wanted, that she was starting to realize I'd been the right person for her all along. She said she'd taken my patience and understanding for granted, that she hadn't recognized how rare it was to find someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. She asked if it was too late for us to try again, if I would be willing to give her another chance now that she understood what she really wanted. She promised that things would be different this time, that she would be fully committed and present in a relationship with me, that she'd learned from her mistakes with Marcus about what really mattered in a partnership. Looking at her sitting across from me, vulnerable and sincere in a way she'd never been before, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me was satisfied that she was finally recognizing my worth, finally understanding what she'd been rejecting for months. Part of me was tempted to take her back, to see if she could actually follow through on her promises of changed behavior. But a larger part of me recognized that this conversation was happening for the wrong reasons. She wasn't interested in me because she genuinely realized we were compatible or because her feelings for me had grown stronger. She was interested in me because her first-choice relationship had disappointed her, because I represented security and consistency after experiencing uncertainty and neglect. I was no longer willing to be someone's consolation prize, even if that someone was Celeste. I'd learned too much about my own worth over the past few months to accept a relationship that was based on her settling for me rather than genuinely choosing me. What I said next would define both of our futures in ways neither of us could have predicted. I looked at Celeste across the table, her eyes still glistening with tears, her hands clasped tightly together as she waited for my response to her plea for another chance. The woman who had spent months keeping me at arm's length while exploring other options was now asking me to risk my heart again based on lessons she'd learned from disappointing experiences with someone else. I spoke slowly and deliberately, wanting to make sure she understood every word I was about to say. I told her that I appreciated her honesty about her mistakes and her recognition of what our relationship could have been. I said I believed she was sincere in her regret and in her desire to try again with me. But I also said that sincerity and good intentions weren't enough to rebuild something that had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. I explained that our entire dynamic had been built on inequality, my willingness to accept whatever level of commitment she was comfortable with while she maintained the freedom to explore other possibilities. Even now, her interest in me was emerging only after her preferred option had proved disappointing. She wasn't choosing me because she'd realized I was the right person for her. She was settling for me because the person she'd really wanted hadn't worked out. Her face crumpled as I spoke, and she started to protest, insisting that her feelings for me were genuine, that she'd always cared about me, that she'd just been confused about what she wanted. She said she'd learned from her experience with Marcus that chemistry and excitement weren't enough to sustain a relationship, that the stability and emotional connection we'd shared were more valuable than she'd realized. But I continued with my explanation, telling her that I'd spent the past few months discovering what it felt like to be someone's first choice, to be with people who were excited about me from the beginning rather than settling for me after other options fell through. I'd learned the difference between being wanted and being needed, between being chosen and being convenient. I told her about my experiences with Rebecca and Natasha, not to hurt her, but to illustrate how different it felt to date people who were genuinely available and interested. Rebecca had been upfront from our first date about wanting something serious, had made time in her schedule to see me regularly, had integrated me into her social circle without hesitation. Natasha had been equally direct about her intentions and had shown consistent enthusiasm for building something meaningful together. Neither of these relationships had the dramatic highs and lows that characterized my interactions with Celeste, but they also didn't have the anxiety and uncertainty that had plagued me for months. I was learning that healthy relationships felt different, calmer, more secure, more reciprocal. I was discovering what it meant to be with someone who matched my investment, rather than someone I had to convince to value what we were building together. Celeste listened to all of this with growing desperation, interrupting occasionally to argue that what we'd had was special, that our deep conversations and emotional connection meant more than the simple compatibility I was describing with other women. She insisted that she could offer me the consistency and commitment I was seeking, that she'd learned from her mistakes and was ready to be the partner I deserved. I could see that she genuinely believed what she was saying, that she'd convinced herself she could transform overnight from someone who valued independence and options into someone ready for exclusive commitment. But I'd also learned enough about human psychology over the past few months to recognize that people don't change fundamental aspects of their personality just because they've experienced disappointment. The woman sitting across from me was the same person who had spent months prioritizing her freedom over our relationship, who had been excited about Marcus after just 2 dates in a way she'd never been excited about me after months of getting to know each other. Her current interest in exclusivity and commitment was a reaction to being rejected by someone she'd preferred, not a genuine evolution in her relationship goals. I told her that I didn't doubt her sincerity, but that I also couldn't base a relationship on her promises of changed behavior. Actions over time were the only reliable indicator of someone's true priorities, and her actions had consistently shown me that I wasn't her first choice. Even if I was willing to give her another chance, I would always be wondering whether she was truly committed to me or just staying until someone more exciting came along. She became more emotional as she realized I wasn't going to change my mind, asking me to at least consider her request, to give her an opportunity to prove that she could be different. She said she understood why I was hesitant, but hoped that our friendship meant enough to me that I'd be willing to take the risk. She promised that she wouldn't disappoint me again, that she'd learned too much from losing me to make the same mistakes twice. The most difficult part of the conversation was seeing how genuinely distressed she was by my rejection. This wasn't manipulative crying or dramatic pleading. She seemed truly devastated by the realization that she'd lost something valuable through her own choices. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her that maybe we could try again in the future when she'd had more time to process her mistakes. But I also recognized that comforting her would send mixed signals about my decision and possibly give her false hope that I might eventually change my mind. The kindest thing I could do for both of us was to be clear and definitive about my choice, to avoid creating additional confusion or uncertainty. I told her that I cared about her as a person and genuinely wanted her to find happiness, but that I couldn't be the person to provide that happiness for her. I said I hoped she would learn from her experiences with both Marcus and me to make better choices in future relationships, to recognize good treatment when she received it, and to value consistency over excitement. I also told her that I thought it would be best if we took a significant break from our friendship, at least until she'd had time to process her disappointment and move forward with her life. Staying in regular contact would be unfair to both of us. It would prevent her from fully accepting my decision and moving on, and it would make it difficult for me to continue building new relationships without the complication of ongoing emotional entanglement with her. She nodded through her tears, acknowledging that a break in contact probably made sense even though she didn't want it. She asked if I thought we might be able to be friends again someday, if enough time passed and she was in a different place in her life. I told her I couldn't predict the future, but that I hoped she'd find the happiness and stability she was looking for, whether that included me in her life or not. When we left the restaurant, I walked her to her car and gave her a final hug that felt like both closure and goodbye. She held on tightly for a moment longer than necessary, and I could feel her reluctance to let go of what we'd shared, even though she'd never fully appreciated it when she'd had it. Driving home that night, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sad because I was definitively closing the door on a relationship that had meant a great deal to me, but relieved because I was finally free from the emotional roller coaster that had defined my interactions with Celeste for so many months. 6 months later, I'm in a committed relationship with Rebecca. We moved in together last month and are talking seriously about marriage and children. She's everything I didn't know I was looking for. Supportive, consistent, enthusiastic about our shared future, and completely available emotionally and practically. We don't have the dramatic intensity that characterized my relationship with Celeste, but we have something better: genuine partnership and mutual respect. I occasionally wonder how Celeste is doing, whether she learned from our experiences together, whether she found someone who could give her the excitement she craved while also providing the stability she eventually realized she needed. I hope she did, though I recognize that her romantic education isn't my responsibility anymore. The most important lesson I learned from those months with Celeste is that you can't earn someone's love through patience and understanding alone. You can't convince someone to value you by accepting whatever level of commitment they're willing to offer. Real love requires mutual choice, mutual investment, mutual excitement about building something together. When someone shows you through their actions that you're not their priority, believe them the first time rather than hoping they'll eventually realize your worth. When someone keeps their options open while expecting your exclusive attention, recognize that you deserve better. When someone only becomes interested in you after their preferred choice disappoints them, understand that you're not being chosen, you're being settled for. I also learned that walking away from someone you care about is sometimes the most loving thing you can do, both for them and for yourself. By refusing to be Celeste's backup plan, I forced her to confront the consequences of her choices and gave myself the opportunity to find someone who genuinely wanted to be with me. The night Celeste told me about her date with Marcus, she expected me to continue playing the role of the understanding friend, to provide emotional support while she pursued someone else. She didn't expect me to recognize my own worth, to develop other options, to refuse to accept the crumbs of her attention. She certainly didn't expect me to turn down her eventual offer of a relationship when it finally came. But by that point, I'd learned that being someone's first choice from the beginning was worth more than being their final choice after all other options had been exhausted. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept less than you deserve, even from someone you care about deeply. Sometimes walking away is the only way to preserve your self-respect and open yourself up to the kind of love that doesn't require you to diminish yourself to receive it. Thanks for being here on Reddit Whispers. I've shared my story, but now I want to hear yours. What's the most surprising decision that turned everything around for you? Your comment could be the lifeline someone else is looking for today. I told her that I had indeed had romantic feelings for her, that I'd hoped our relationship might develop into something more serious over time.